Greetings all, or perhaps I should say bonjour or bonsoir, given the subject matter at hand today. Today's episode of Character Development marks not only the first of a new year, but also the first of a new decade. And what better way to commemorate the 2020s than by looking at a video game character that, in a sense, lets me talk about the 1920s. That's right, we're going back to the colorful cast of Yostar's 20th century battleship game, Azur Lane. It's been a fair while since I last talked about this game, and I've been pretty eager to hop back in, given how cool and creative many of the ship designs are. And today's episode is even more of a passion project than usual. Because out of all the characters in Azur Lane, including popular choices like Akagi, Bismarck, and Enterprise, or characters that are interesting for historical references like Edinburgh, Anshan, and Tai-Ho, the one I want to talk about today is my personal favorite in the roster thus far. Though I've long gotten the impression that she hasn't been all too popular among Azur Lane's English-speaking community. That character being the FFNF Saint-Louis, the first French ship to be added to the catalog. I had hinted in the last Azur Lane themed episode that I'd probably talk about Saint-Louis next, though it's not quite the end of 2019 like I had originally promised. Creative burnout has an odd way of hitting at inopportune, unannounced times. Ah well, at least I remember. And I had plenty of existing research notes that made easing back in just a little less daunting of a task. Saint-Louis might not have the advantage of popularity, but in terms of her design and personality, as well as how those reflect the historical namesake of the ship she's meant to be, oh my goodness is there a lot to appreciate here. Getting to talk about Saint-Louis gives me a platform to gush about a whole bunch of French history. Not only World War II and the interwar period before it, but also bits of classical, medieval, and early modern era France. That being said, this episode is quite overdue already, and given how technical and possibly confusing things are going to be today, the sooner we can start, the better. I'm the Kitsune Hawk, and today we're going to be digging into a mix of real and hypothetical history as I discuss my favorite ship from Azur Lane's current lineup, the FFNF Saint-Louis. So get out your pencils, trivia enthusiasts, because this is Character Development. So in an episode like this, I would normally start with a rundown of the real-life boat and its record at sea both in and out of war. But Saint-Louis is in a unique category, separate from the majority of Azur Lane's humanized warships. More specifically, in the game's terminology, Saint-Louis is referred to as a priority ship, meaning that she's based on a warship that never actually fought, or even existed, in World War II. Most of these priority ships didn't advance much further than basic schematics, so that means today's history lesson will be more abstract in nature. And it might get a little complex and intricate as I attempt to explain how the heavy cruiser Saint-Louis and her sister ships were named and planned for war, but never constructed or even fully planned out. Even though the 20th century is far from my actual field of study, I'm gonna try my best here. After the horrors and devastation brought by the Great War in the 1910s, the major powers of the world sought to take measures that would prevent another war of that scale from happening. One recurring aspect of these policies was the idea of international naval disarmament, initiated in 1922 at the Washington Naval Conference. 9 countries in total convened at this first conference: the United States, Great Britain, Japan, France, Italy, China, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Belgium. 3 treaties resulted from the meeting, placing limits on the quantity and size of each nation's battleships and aircraft carriers. These limits were twofold, applying to individual ships as well as the total size of each participant's navy. Then in 1927, there was the first Geneva Naval Conference, which was supposed to extend the number and size limits of the Washington Naval Treaties so that they also applied to cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. But this meeting failed to be of any success because 1. France and Italy declined their invitations and didn't show up, and 2. The resulting meeting between Great Britain, Japan, and the US didn't produce a conclusive deal. The 5 countries would try again at the first London Naval Conference in 1930, finally extending the policy of quantity and size limits to other types of warships. Despite all the progress made thus far, it all fell apart as the 1930s progressed. Under the new leadership of Adolf Hitler, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933. By 1935, Hitler had enacted policies of conscription and remilitarization, which included the public announcement of a new air force, the Luftwaffe. Also in 1935, representatives from Great Britain and Nazi Germany met to sign the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which allowed the German Kriegsmarine to expand up to 35% of the British Royal Navy's size. This enraged the French government, who denounced them severely. France was never consulted about this decision and its potential ramifications, condemning the British for enabling the Germans to continue violating their restrictions listed in the Treaty of Versailles. In response to Great Britain's neglect of international treaties, as well as the growing threats of German and Italian remilitarization, France chose to violate the Washington Naval Treaty in 1935 by ordering the construction of the fast battleship Richelieu, which, combined with the existing Dunkirk-class battleships, exceeded France's total tonnage limit. France violated the treaties again in 1936 with the construction of another Richelieu-class battleship, the Jean Bart. This was carried out in response to the announcement of the Italian Littorio-class battleships, which also violated the treaty-defined limits, all but standard behavior for Italy at this point. Between all of these infringements in Europe, as well as Japan's denunciations of the naval treaties as being unfairly arranged against them, it became clear that naval disarmament was a lofty idea failing in execution. World War II officially began in Europe with Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, with both France and Britain declaring war on Germany just 2 days later. Barring the brief Saar offensive, the French spent the first months in a phony war, so named because the British and French were trying to determine the best course of action in dealing with Germany on land. The navies of Great Britain and France, however, were much more involved, and part of the French response was to either suspend or reconfigure all ongoing naval construction, so that they could quickly muster additional warships to fight the German Kriegsmarine. One of these plans, previously referred to as C5, became the foundation for a new class of 6 heavy cruisers, each named after a famous French monarch, and with most of the names being reused from late 19th century French battleships. The Algérie-class heavy cruisers would be the model to emulate, and now that peace had turned to war, the French were no longer restrained by international treaties. Time was their enemy now. The namesake ship of this newly planned class was the Saint-Louis, named after King Louis IX, who ruled over France from 1226 to 1270. Known for his great piety, both good and bad, Louis IX commissioned the construction of Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, amassed a collection of holy relics for the Catholic Church, reinforced ongoing Inquisition efforts against heretics and Jews, and participated in both the 7th Crusade in 1248 and the 8th Crusade in 1270. Although he died during the 8th Crusade, his death was followed by a series of attested miracles, especially acts of miraculous healing, which, alongside his ascribed charity and unwavering faith, justified his canonization as a saint in 1297. A bit ironic, though, when you consider that he died from catching dysentery shortly after arriving in Tunisia. Brushing aside my poor attempt at cynical humor there, King Louis IX's legacy lives on in a multitude of places and objects named in his honor. From the Ile Saint-Louis in Paris, to St. Louis, Missouri, Lake Saint-Louis in Quebec, São Luís in Brazil, and of course, the would-be warship that now lives on in Azur Lane. Even the USS St. Louis, another ship featured in Azur Lane, is indirectly named after King Louis IX. But of course, we can't just stop with that, because the history lover in me wants to go over the significance of Saint-Louis' sister ships as well. 2 of the planned Saint-Louis-class heavy cruisers were meant to be named after leaders of the Gauls, the tribal Celtic inhabitants of France before their conquest by the Romans. The Brenos, named after a 4th century BCE Gallic chieftain who besieged and sacked the city of Rome itself, and the Vercingetorix, named after a 1st century BCE chieftain who united his neighboring tribes and fought against the armies of Julius Caesar and his allies. 2 more cruisers were intended to be named after kings of the Franks, the earliest form of what many would recognize as the French identity. The first was the Charlemagne, named after a de facto Frankish king who held power from 718 to 741 CE. Fitting for a warship, Martel's reign is mostly remembered for its military importance, including campaigns to convert the Saxon pagans and put an end to their border raids, and, more famously, the Battle of Tours in 732, during which an Islamic invasion of France was halted. The second of these early medieval-inspired ship names was the Charlemagne, named after perhaps the most famous of all the Frankish kings. Charlemagne was the grandson of Charles Martel, ruling as a proper king between 768 and 814. And boy, did a lot happen during his reign. To condense it heavily, Charlemagne expanded the kingdom of the Franks to its greatest territorial extent, spanning from modern Catalonia to Czechia, spread Christianity further into Central Europe, conceptualized a model for secular education in his court, and was declared the first Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day 800 CE. The last of the 6 planned heavy cruisers was the Henri IV, named after King Henry IV, sometimes referred to as the Good King or Le Bon Roi. Reigning between 1589 and 1610, Henry IV took power during the tumultuous French Wars of Religion, becoming France's first Protestant king, but he would also renounce his Protestantism to become Catholic, at least in name, for the sake of his royal legitimacy. By far his most important achievement was ending the French Wars of Religion in 1598 via the Edict of Nantes, which granted social and legal concessions to France's Protestant population and promoted the idea of recognizing civil unity over religious unity, at least until it was revoked in 1685. But as grand and patriotic as all of these ships and their names were, they also never happened. Rather, they were never fully realized and didn't make it past the planning phase. Overwhelmed by the arrival of the German Wehrmacht in May 1940, and with Paris occupied just over a month after the initial invasion, the government of France surrendered in late June of the same year. Because of this, all further work on the Saint-Louis class was cancelled. Only 3 of the 6 cruisers were ordered in the first place, and none of them had a finalized armor or engine design at the time they were abandoned. So how does Azur Lane even have a design then, with all the armor and rigging surrounding Saint-Louis' body? The answer is collaboration. Specifically, collaboration with World of Warships, another naval combat-themed video game. Remember what I said earlier, how all of Azur Lane's priority ships were based on planned warships that were never completed? Well, fully completed and functional imaginings of these very same ships appear in World of Warships. And that aforementioned collaboration between Wargaming and Yostar is how Azur Lane's priority ships get their in-game stats, special abilities, and the designs for the armor and guns surrounding the actual character. How about we start there then? In World of Warships, the design used for Saint-Louis is essentially an improved version of the heavy cruiser Algérie, just as the French Marine Nationale envisioned back in 1940. Currently though, the Algérie doesn't have a counterpart in Azur Lane, at least not yet, so I can't make a direct comparison in that regard. What I can draw similarities to, though, are Saint-Louis' skills in Azur Lane. Saint-Louis has 4 special abilities in total, not counting upgrades. 2 of these are direct references to her counterpart in World of Warships. The first, Engine Boost, is based on a gameplay feature that all French cruisers have in World of Warships. In that game, it allows a ship to increase their top speed and engine power for purposes of maneuverability, whereas in Azur Lane, it provides Saint-Louis with a temporary evasion boost, occasionally nullifying damage from enemy fire and metaphorically accomplishing the same goal. The other skill worth mentioning is Augmented HE Ammo, which increases the damage Saint-Louis does with high explosive guns, at the cost of lowering their chance to ignite enemy targets. This is directly borrowed from one of the commander skills in World of Warships, Inertia Fuse for HE Shells, which does just about the same thing. And now comes the fun part. The reason why I went into those bite-sized portions of French history just a few minutes ago. Because the real-life heavy cruiser Saint-Louis was never fully realized, the character designers at Yostar decided to fill in the gaps by taking additional inspiration from the almost ship's namesake, King Saint Louis IX. Much like France's 13th century Crusader King, Saint-Louis displays a very noticeably pious personality, with a majority of her voice lines conveying the centrality of her Christian zeal. Perhaps in reference to King Louis IX's charity and penance, 3 of her lines in particular convey that she isn't personally interested in mission rewards, and sees suffering and hardship as both the brand of a warrior and a trial of God. Both the Chinese and Japanese versions of the latter line even use specific phrases associated with the suffering of Jesus on the cross. On a similar note, I'd also like to think that the spear she carries is another callback to the Crusades, as one of the most famous relics found during the Crusades in the Holy Land was a fragment of what was believed to be the Holy Lance, the spear that was stabbed into Jesus' side during his crucifixion, as mentioned in the Gospel of John. To be more specific, this proclaimed relic was discovered during the First Crusade, at the Second Siege of Antioch in 1098. Even though the rather plainly named Holy Lance of Antioch was later declared to be a sham, even being doubted at the time it was found, its proclaimed discovery was a significant boost to morale, motivating the Crusaders to defend Antioch from recapture, and it remains an icon of the First Crusade. Otherwise, it could just be a general reference to King Louis IX's famous role as a crusader, or perhaps an enhanced version of the scepter he's frequently portrayed with. Another subtle detail I noticed was Saint-Louis' self-introduction in the game's archives. She refers to herself as an illusion and a manifestation of an ideal. Taken alongside the mention that she was reduced to nothingness when her homeland fell, it's a really clever way of addressing her identity as a warship that never existed, and a figure who stands before the player looking far more like the ship's namesake than the other priority ships, or even many of the cast at large. I also love how blue is utilized as the primary non-monochrome color in Saint-Louis' design. King Louis IX was the first king of France noted to regularly dress in blue. And even if this wasn't what the character designers at Yostar were referencing directly, Louis IX's hot new fashion sense contributed in part to the long-standing association of the color blue with French nobility. An association that you could argue continues today, with how often we use blue to represent French culture in general. Also noticeable in Saint-Louis' design is the use of gold for ornamentation, likely meant to evoke the fleur de lis, a golden lily used as a symbol in French heraldry for centuries before becoming a common symbol of France as a whole. White, yet another color associated with French nobility, especially its last dynasty, the House of Bourbon, is also prominently used in Saint-Louis' design, altogether giving her a very regal, and very French, look in conjunction with the blue and gold. Quite honestly, if you took away all the naval accessories surrounding her, she could actually work pretty well as a Fate Servant. Whether she'd be a Lancer or Ruler class, though, take your pick. Alright, so I should probably stop with my Crusader Queen propaganda. I've gone on for quite long enough. It's pretty evident now why she's my current favorite in Azur Lane's ever-growing fleet of warships. The priority ships as a whole have a very distinct air of creativity around them, turning the disadvantage of limited information into an advantage. And while some of them are definitely popular, like Rune or Monarch, I've been surprised at the lesser attention Saint-Louis has received since her debut. Maybe it's because I'm a sucker for medieval European history, maybe it's because I really like the hypothetical edge of a warship that never was, or maybe it's because the references in Saint-Louis' design and dialogue remind me of similar historical figures but reimagined franchises, like Fate or Koei Tecmo's Many Warriors series. But Saint-Louis has always stuck out to me, even before she came to Azur Lane's English servers, and I knew I'd get to talking about her on this show eventually. At the very least, maybe I've given a few of you some newfound appreciation for Saint-Louis, and if I have, I'd consider this video a success. She's certainly overdue for some extra love from Yostar and the community that's formed around Azur Lane. And so, with this episode now properly behind us, do I have any predictions for the next Azur Lane themed character analysis, whenever that might be? Maybe. Seeing as I've covered 2 Japanese ships and 1 French ship now, the logical thing to do would be to discuss a British or German ship next. Or maybe one of the Italian ships, since their role in World War II isn't as commonly discussed. But if I pick from my personal favorites instead, I'd certainly love to talk about Miss Tai-Ho.